The morning they came off the truck, it was a Tuesday in late September of 2003, and the fog was sitting so low on the bottoms that you couldn't see the fence line from the barn door. I remember that specifically because I had walked out before first light to check on a heifer that had been favoring her left rear leg, and when I heard the diesel coming up to County Road, I thought for a moment it was my neighbor Harold coming to tell me something had gotten into his corn again. But it wasn't Harold. It was a livestock hauler out of a sale barn 3 counties east. And he was 2 hours early, and he was carrying 35 of the sorriest-looking stalker steers I had ever seen in my 61 years of looking at cattle. They came down that ramp in the gray September fog like something from an old photograph of hard times, all hip bones and dull eyes, and hides the color of creek mud in August. 35 head. My wife Margaret had paid $28 for the lot of them at a dispersal sale the previous Thursday, which works out to 80 cents a head on cattle that were averaging about 100 pounds under where they should have been for their frame. People at that sale had let them go because the drought of 2003 had been running hard since May, and thin cattle on dry ground looked like a problem with no upside. Margaret had driven home that evening, set her purse on the kitchen table, and told me what she'd done with the quiet expression she uses when she's already decided, and doesn't require my agreement. I asked her what she was going to do with 35 starving steers in the middle of a drought year, and she said, "I'm going to put them on the back 80 and see what they find." I want to be honest about how I felt standing in that fog, watching them come off the ramp. I felt the particular kind of dread that comes from knowing your spouse is smarter than you, but not yet being able to see why. The neighbor I am thinking of, and I will not say his name because he still buys hay from me, and we are on decent terms, drove his truck down to the gate that same morning around 8 o'clock. He had a truck that was always cleaner than a working farm truck has any business being, and he idled it there at the gate, with his window down, looking at those steers in the pasture with the expression men use when they are being polite about something they think is foolish. He said Margaret paid cash for those, and I said she had. He looked at them a while longer, the way you look at a hand of cards that is clearly going to lose. He said, "There's no water back there that isn't hauled, you know that." I told him I knew it. He said, "You're going to spend more feeding them through to weight than you'll ever get back at today's prices." I told him maybe. He nodded like a man who has said the reasonable thing and been heard, and he drove back up the road, and by noon the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown. The version at the diner had Margaret paying $40 for 40 head of cattle that were already dead on arrival, and me standing in the fog arguing with a livestock hauler about it. None of that was true, but the shape of the skepticism was accurate enough. The extension office sent a young man out 2 weeks later, not because we called them, but because someone must have mentioned it, and he had a clipboard and a new pair of Carhartts that still had the fold marks in them. He walked to the fence line with me and looked at the back 80 and told me that, based on the forage assessment from the county drought survey, that pasture was carrying roughly 40% of its normal carrying capacity, and that 35 head of stocker steers on degraded summer pasture without a reliable water source was, and he used this word carefully, inadvisable. He had a column of numbers on his clipboard that were meant to end the conversation. I thanked him for coming out. He drove away. Those are the two kinds of experts you meet in this life. The kind whose numbers are designed to stop you, and the kind whose silence means they've seen something real. What I hadn't told a neighbor or the extension man, because it wasn't any of their business, and because I hadn't fully worked out what it meant yet, was that I hadn't chosen the back 80 at random. Margaret had, but she hadn't chosen it randomly either. She had grown up on that ground. Her father, a man named Clarence, who died in the winter of 1991 at the age of 78, had farmed those acres for 40 years before his knees gave out, and he started leasing the tillable ground to a row crop neighbor. Clarence was the kind of man who kept notes. Not the kind of notes most farmers keep, which are mostly receipts and complaint, but real observational notes, written in a marbled composition book with a blue cover that had gone soft and pale from years in the breast pocket of his work coat. He kept those books the way a ship's navigator keeps a log, because he believed the land was always telling you something, and if you didn't write it down, you'd forget it by the time it mattered again. When he died, Margaret packed the books into a cedar chest in the back bedroom, because she wasn't ready to read them, and she knew they'd keep. I want to say that plainly because I think it's important. She wasn't ready. Some things have to wait until you have enough of your own years on the ground before the older person's words resolve into sense. That is not weakness, that is how inheritance actually works. The chest sat in the back bedroom for 12 years, and the books sat in the chest, and nobody opened it. And then in the second week of August 2003, when the drought had been running for 3 months, and the pond in the back pasture had dropped to a gray slick of cracked mud that wouldn't have watered a dog, Margaret went to the cedar chest and opened it and started reading. She read for 3 evenings in a row. Sitting at the kitchen table after supper with a cup of coffee, she kept forgetting to drink. She didn't tell me what she was reading. She had the expression of a person doing arithmetic on something important and not wanting to be interrupted. On the 4th evening, she looked up and asked me, "Did you know there used to be a spring somewhere on the back 80?" I told her I'd heard something about a wet area in the northwest corner, but I'd always figured it had played out or been tiled over. She said Daddy didn't think it was played out. She said it carefully, the way she says things she's not entirely sure of yet. Then she went back to reading. I want to tell you about the notebook, because it is the real center of this story. Clarence had kept 7 of those blue marbled composition books over 40 years, and the entries in them were terse and specific, in the way that men of his generation were terse and specific, because paper and time were both worth something, and you didn't waste either one. The entries had dates and temperatures and rainfall, in inches and soil descriptions that used words I had to think about, words like friable and mottled and glide, which is an old term for soil that has been waterlogged long enough that the iron in it has changed color. He wrote about crop yields by field and by row, about which fence posts were cedar and which were treated pine, and when each one had gone in, about the behavior of his cattle in various weather conditions, about where the deer ran in November, and what that told him about wind and browse. And on the 43rd page of the 6th notebook, in an entry dated a Tuesday in July of 1974, he had written the following. And I am quoting it exactly, because Margaret copied it out in her own hand on a piece of notebook paper that she tucked into the frame of the kitchen window where it stayed for 6 months. He wrote, "Northwest corner fence, 3rd post from the cottonwood, steers working the ground with their front feet. Not playing. Working. Rock underneath can't be more than 2 feet. Never dug." Below that in the margin he had written one more word and put a question mark after it. The word was cold. I put that detail away and didn't go out to look for 3 weeks. I'll own that. I had a hay contract to finish and a tractor that needed a hydraulic line replaced, and the ordinary reasons a person finds not to go look at the thing they are already mostly certain about. The steers were out there eating what the drought had left, and I was hauling water to them every other day in a 300-gallon tank on the back of the flatbed. And the cost of that was adding up in a way that the neighbor's early arithmetic had predicted, and I was aware of that, and I put the notebook entry away and got on with the pressing things. But here is what I noticed in those 3 weeks, and I noticed it without meaning to. The way you notice things on ground. You've walked enough times that the anomalies register before you've consciously looked for them. The steers were not distributing themselves evenly across the back 80 the way cattle on dry pasture normally do, drifting toward the lowest ground and whatever shade is available. They were drifting consistently northwest. Not every day, not in a straight line, but when I drove out to check them in the evenings, they were more often than not in the northwest quadrant of the pasture, clustered in a way that had a center to it, an origin point they were working around. Cattle do this when there is something drawing them. Water, mineral, shade, a smell in the soil. They are not sophisticated animals in most respects, but they are very old animals. And they have been reading ground longer than any credential we've invented. I noticed it, and I filed it, and I kept hauling water, and I waited until the tractor was fixed and the hay was delivered, and I had a morning with nothing urgent in front of me. That morning came on a Thursday in mid-October. Rest. The first hard frost was 4 or 5 days off. You could feel it in the way the air sat still and thin in the low places before sunup. I put on my boots and took the soil probe and a long-handled spade and walked the back 80 from the southeast corner toward the northwest in a grid, the way Clarence's notebooks had taught me to walk ground, not toward the thing you are looking for, but across the whole field in sequence, so you don't let your hunch tell you where to point your feet. I took probe readings every 30 yards and wrote them on the back of an envelope. The soil in the southeast was hard and dry, as expected, cracked at the surface and compacted below, the kind of ground that drought leaves behind. As I moved northwest, the readings started to change. The depth to resistance decreased, which told me rock was shallower, and the color of the soil core coming up on the probe darkened. A blue-gray color that I recognized from Clarence's word, glide, waterlogged, long enough to change the iron. At the third post from the cottonwood, along the northwest fence, which I found without needing to count, because there is a knot on that post at eye level that I have passed 100 times without remarking on it. The soil probe went down 14 inches and stopped on something that rang back up the handle the way stone does when it is continuous and close-grained. I pulled the probe. The core was dark and wet, and the smell that came off it was the smell of cold iron and deep water, clean and mineral. The smell that has no name in common speech, but that every person who has worked ground long enough knows immediately. I pressed my hand into the hole and felt the soil. And 14 inches below the surface of a pasture that had not seen meaningful rain in 4 months, the soil was saturated. Not damp. Saturated. I took the spade and opened a hole 2 feet across and 2 feet deep in the northwest corner. Third post from the cottonwood. 9 inches down I hit rock. 12 inches down I hit the seam. The water came up into the hole within 4 minutes of my breaking through. It came up cold and clear and steady, not a seep, a genuine flow, and it tasted, when I cupped my hand and drank it, the way water tastes when it has been in the earth long enough to pick up everything the earth knows how to give. I stood there for a while. I was 61 years old, and I had been on this ground, or near it, for the better part of 30 years, and I had never known this was here. Clarence had known. He had known it the way you know something you saw once and couldn't prove and wrote down with a question mark because you wanted to come back and answer it, and then you ran out of years. The tile was there. The spring was there. It had never been developed, never been dug, never been opened, exactly as the 6th notebook said, never dug. I went back to the barn and I thought about who to call. And I called a man I knew named Roy, who had spent 35 years laying drainage tile and developing farm springs in the county. A quiet man who charged fair and didn't talk much, which are the 2 qualifications that matter. Roy came out on a Friday morning and looked at the hole I dug and stood still beside it for a long time with his hands in his coat pockets. He did not say much while he was looking. That is the thing about the validating expert that I have come to trust over the years. They go quiet when they see something real, because what they are seeing requires them to revise a number of assumptions, and that takes a moment. Roy crouched down and looked at the water level in the hole and watched it for probably 4 minutes without speaking. Then he stood up and looked at me and said one word. He said, "Substantial." I asked him what he thought the flow rate was, and he said he'd want to put a pipe on it and measure for 24 hours before he quoted me a number. But his eye said, "Substantial." We put a perforated collection tile on it the following week. A 6-inch line running south to a concrete collection box. I poured myself on a Saturday when the temperature was still holding above freezing. The measured flow rate, after 24 hours on the pipe, was 11 gallons per minute. 11 gallons per minute from a spring that had been sitting sealed under 9 inches of topsoil and a layer of fractured limestone, while every pond and creek in the county ran down to nothing in the worst drought in 20 years. The collection box held 600 gallons before it overflowed into the overflow line. I ran to the low end of the northwest quadrant, and the cattle found it within 40 minutes of my opening the valve. They did not rush it or mob it the way thirsty cattle mob a water tank. They walked to it in a slow line and drank. And the steers that had been working that corner of the fence with their front feet for 6 weeks were the first ones there. They had known. They had been standing on top of it and working the ground with their hooves, not playing, working exactly as Clarence had written in July of 1974, and I had watched them do it for 3 weeks before I trusted what they were showing me. The land doesn't care who believes in it. That is the first thing Clarence wrote at the top of his first notebook, a Tuesday in April of 1961, in handwriting that was steady and unhurried. The land doesn't care who believes in it. It just keeps doing what it does until someone pays attention long enough to see it. The steers went to the processor in the first week of March 2004, 162 days after they came off that truck in the fog. They averaged 840 pounds on the rail, which was 60 pounds better than the frame on those cattle would have predicted when they arrived. And the premium for the spring water, which is not something you can put on a scale, but which shows up in the fat cover and the marbling. When an animal has had clean, cold mineral water its whole finishing period, that premium came out in the hanging weight and in what the small processor up the road, a man who had been cutting beef for 30 years. A nupter told me when he called with the yield numbers. He said, "I don't know what you were watering those with, but the fat on those cattle is exceptional." I wrote that word down next to Clarence's word substantial, because I believe in keeping a record, and because someday someone is going to open my notebooks and I want the important words to be there. The neighbor came by in late March when the steers were already gone and the spring was running clear into the collection box and the overflow was greening up a strip along the low northwest fence line, even though the rest of the pasture was still winter pale and flat. He stopped his truck at the gate and looked at the green strip for a while with his window down. He said, "That's not as dry back there as it was." I told him we'd found a spring. He looked at the green strip a while longer. He said, "Ha!" And then he drove on. That was the concession. That one word, delivered without ceremony, from a man who had been certain I was wrong. It was enough. I have never needed more than that from a neighbor. The extension man did not come back, which is fine. He was doing his job with the information he had. And the information he had was accurate for the ground as anyone had understood it, which is the limitation of information that has never been tested against the thing it describes. I want to close by telling you what I think about on the mornings. I walk the back 80 now, which I still do, because walking your own ground is not optional if you want to understand it. I think about the $28 Margaret paid for 35 starving steers, and I think about the 11 gallons a minute running into a concrete box I poured on a Saturday afternoon, and I think about 30 years I walked that fence line without stopping at the third post from the cottonwood long enough to put my hand on the ground. And I think about Clarence, who stopped there in July of 1974 and watched his steers work the ground with their front feet and wrote it down and put a question mark after a word and then ran out of years before he got back to answer it. He was trusting that whoever came after him would eventually slow down enough to read what he'd left. That is a particular kind of faith, the faith that the patient note left in a soft old notebook will find its way to someone with enough quiet in them to hear it. The difference between a problem and a gift is sometimes only whether you were paying attention, and sometimes the gift has been sitting 9 inches under your boots for 30 years. My grandfather used to say that the ground rewards the man who asks it questions more than the man who tells it what it is. I believe that. I believe it because I watched 35 hollow-flanked steers walk off a truck in September fog and immediately begin teaching me something I was too busy to learn for 3 weeks, and because a man I never met well enough to really know left me the answer in a blue marbled notebook in the 6th entry from the back. If you have got your own piece of ground with something in it the county survey missed, or an old notebook you haven't been ready to open yet, or an animal that keeps working the same corner of the fence for reasons nobody has bothered to ask, I would genuinely like to hear about it in the comments below. The patient thing and the overlooked thing are usually the same thing, and they are almost always worth the time it takes to put your hand in the ground and find out. Subscribe if this meant something to you, and come back, because we move slow on this channel, but we get there.